Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. And we are kicking off our sixth webinar here for California APA and the California Planning Roundtable in response to the LA fire. Today, we've got two fantastic experts here, and I'm going to introduce them. We're going to roll through a series of questions, and then we're going to open it up for some questions from all of you. I'll start off with a little bit about me. So I've been a planner and a community development director, city manager for more than 30 years. I retired from the City of Livermore in 2022. At the very beginning of my career, I was an intern for the city of Coalinga, recovering from another kind of disaster, a devastating earthquake that leveled their downtown and affected virtually every housing unit in the entire city. So working for a community that's recovering from that does give you a taste for sort of the overwhelming odds of how sort of these disasters that strike our communities create challenges for us in the profession and for the cities that we serve and the jurisdictions that we serve. I currently am a lecturer at San Francisco State University, teaching in their Masters of Public Administration program on policy implementation. And I'm a member of the California Planning Roundtable, of course, a policy research and development resource for the California planning profession. First, I'd like to introduce Stuart Tom. Stuart spent many years as the fire marshal and the building official for the city of Glendale. He's co-authored a number of provisions in the International Building Code, as well as the California Building Code. He currently serves on a number of statewide committees, including CalBO, Cal Chiefs Building and Fire Advisory Committee, for which he's a past chair. He was elected to the ICC Board of Directors, where he served as a Section A delegate until 2021. And then he was elected to the board's executive committee, where he served as president of the board of directors in 2024. In 2016, he was appointed to the board of directors for the International Accreditation Service, responsible for accrediting municipal building departments and fire departments, which demonstrate compliance with strict performance standards. So Stuart is truly an expert in the code. He's a co-author of a number of codes, and he's right in the middle of sort of the development process for those new codes. Also joining us is Barbara Static-Wolfson, and she is a fire advisor with the University of California Cooperative Extension, Agricultural National Resources. She received her BS and MS degrees in forestry from Northern Arizona University, specializing in fire ecology. She spent 20 years of experience in fire, including science, communication, and research. Her primary responsibilities include wildland fire-related research and outreach for the Central Coast region, while building trust, strong partnerships, and collaborative relationships with both professional and non-professional communities. She researches issues to address some of the questions behind the use of prescribed fire in a variety of ecosystems, such as coastal prairies and oak woodlands, and helps communities build resilience to wildland fire so residents can live safely within fire-adapted landscapes. And we're going to talk a little bit about that last piece as we start off. So Barbara, I'm going to start off with you. And could you talk a little bit about what you do and the kinds of clients you work with?
Sure. I typically work more with private landowners, but I do also have a lot of partners who work for state parks. I have some federal partners. My region doesn't happen to have a lot of federal land, so I also work with CAL FIRE. I work with community groups like fire safe councils and prescribed burn associations. I'm pretty active with our prescribed burn association, just trying to get more prescribed fire on the ground. So some of the research I do is more on the ecology side, but I'm also doing some social, sort of the social side of research and looking at, acceptance of prescribed fire. I started a new event, the Central Coast Good Fire Fair. And so we're just trying to see how people perceive fire in their own landscape, because it's here and it's not going away.
That is certainly true. So sometimes I've heard the term WUI. or wildland urban interface. So what is that, and sort of why does it matter?
The WUI is basically where, the wildland meets the urban areas. And it's always been, there are, a couple different definitions. Basically, the University of Wisconsin came up with those definitions like 20, 30 years ago. I think it's becoming less relevant, mainly because of these urban conflagrations that we're seeing, where yes, that space is important, but we can't ignore the more urban areas as well.
So it's not a line, in other words, there's not a
Right.
first row of houses that if you fixed that first row of houses, you'd never have a problem ever. It is it is more of a zone or an area, or talk just a little bit about that, because 30 years ago we were taught that if you just are very, very careful at that border, good things happen. Yet as we see these huge conflagrations, we see that things travel, thousands of yards, miles from sort of their initial ignition point. So is a WUI a thing anymore, or are we all just in the WUI and we just haven't admitted it yet?
Well, I personally live, I'm looking out my window. I'm working at home today. I'm looking out my window and I personally live, up against open space. So I live in the WUI,
Mhm.
but all of the people on the other side of me need to do their part as well. And the reason for that is that ember cast. And here I can show one of my images, if I can get there. That basically, for years, people thought, and in my field in fire, they focused on, basically a wall of fire coming up to your house. And that's not necessarily the case. I mean, it does happen, but the three forms of, fire exposure is that direct flame contact where you have that wall of fire that makes its way to your house. But embers is really the biggest one these days, and that is the one that's really causing those urban conflagrations. Radiant heat is another type of exposure, and I think that Stuart will be able to speak a little more to that. But the embers is really what we're trying to focus on a lot more within the WUI, but even beyond the WUI, because once one home, when you have all those homes that are close together, once one home starts from those embers, that's when an urban conflagration, and we can never say that word, can we? That's really when that, becomes an issue.
So I'm gonna thank you. I'm gonna ask Stuart a question. So the illustration there talked about three ways that buildings catch on fire. Stuart, can you talk a little bit about building hardening? I mean, I know I just started a question that sort of like, describe World War II. So it's a big question, but in simplest terms, what does it mean from a building code standpoint, to harden a building, and what does that feel like to a layperson like we are?
Sure. But before I do,
Please do.
Barbara had some fantastic points to explain why WUI issues aren't really defined just to a line, as you said, or a zone. But one thing that I thought she was going to say is that there is one significant difference in every major fire that we have seen so far that is associated with a WUI event, and that is that there is a concurrent situation. While the wildland area is burning unchecked, our resources get overwhelmed. And so if you are in an area where those resources are overwhelmed because there are hundreds to thousands to hundreds of thousands of acres in severe instances that are burning, you really can't count on the fire department showing up at your door to put out the fire. We get fires in urban settings all the time. The big difference when something starts out in the wildland and moves into neighborhoods is that our resources are overwhelmed. And so that's where the whole concept of hardening comes into play. And the simple answer to your question is, what is home hardening? It's taking steps to reduce the likelihood of initial ignition. And I need to emphasize initial ignition because the objective is to take steps to see to it that that first fire does not start. There are certain aspects of all buildings which make them more likely to ignite. And if steps are taken to reduce the likelihood that they will ignite, the end goal is to change the property, change the structure so that it is much more likely to survive a fire event, even if first responders don't show up.
That is, I always tell people that. People who ask me, how can I, what should I do? And I always say, pretend no one's coming.
So, in a normal response, the first responder might be there in 6 minutes or 7 minutes. Second engine and third engine might be on site for a home fire in 10 minutes and 12 minutes. So you might have a whole group of folks working really hard to put out your fire, before 15 minutes happens. And so the wildland, when we have a wildland fire, there's two things that are happening. First of all, original resources were diverted to fight the wildland. And then second of all, what limited resources are left have now multiple ignitions that they're trying to deal with. So not just your house, but unfortunately, a half a dozen houses or a dozen houses or a bunch have, even at the very beginning, have started. And so there's no one left to come rushing to you. So let's say that sounds like a great idea from both a policy understanding of kind of like, okay, I got the basics here. The idea is to have my building not catch on fire, at least have that time when it expanded out, that we go not just a minute or two, but we go to an hour or a few hours when the building can survive on that. So, Tom, can you give an example of what hardening looks like in a real live residential building? Does it have to do with materials or openings or what's next to it or stuff like that?
Yeah, hardening is actually a strategy. Okay. There's no one single recipe to harden a home or a piece of property. I'll let Barbara follow up with talking about some of the defensible space issues, while I will focus more on the construction and building code issues. But hardening basically comes in two forms. You can harden a structure from the very start when it is first built. And if that is to be achieved, we actually have some very, very good guidelines in the California Building Code. They exist in the Building Code in Chapter 7A, or in the Residential Code, Section R337. The standards in both of those sections are essentially the same. And if you are building a new structure, essentially what it does is it requires that the exterior envelope of the building, the walls and roof, be constructed of ignition resistant materials. We refer to it as IRM. And that certain features within the envelope, such as windows and doors and vents, be also selected in a manner that will reduce the likelihood of ignition. The second method of hardening takes place when you have an existing home. And the reality of it is, and the reason that most of our communities are at risk, is that most buildings are existing. And they were built well before these really, really good standards were developed, because these standards were first made effective in California, July 1st, 2008, which is pretty recent, okay? And so it virtually every home, every business, every industrial building, every church, every school that was built prior to 2008, they're not likely to have all of these ignition resistant features. And so in that sense, hardening is referred to as taking steps to retroactively make subtle improvements to those structures to also make them less likely to ignite. And there are certain areas which are the ones that we recommend people focus on. Sometimes they're low cost, sometimes they can be expensive, but you time it with other activities that you would be doing to your building. And those are the roof, the vents, such as your attic vents and crawl space vents, your windows. And if you have a building that has combustible wooden siding, whether it's panelized wood product or wood shingle siding, that's also something that you would eventually want to take some action and replace it with a more resistant material.
Got it. So let's say I'll take my house as an example, because I have a cement shingle siding that was supposed to look like wood, but it sort of has that cement in the center of it. And it's getting ready to be the time when I might change out my windows. So is that a case where maybe the siding is okay, but I really need to concentrate on the roof, the openings, and the windows as I retrofit that? Is that kind of a life cycle kind of an issue? I'm going to have to change the roof in another 4 or 5 years, probably. Building's getting to be that age.
Yes, that's exactly right. And in fact, some communities, when they adopt their local codes every 3 years, they look at these standards to determine whether or not they want to amend their codes to include these provisions, because the reality of it is the cost to replace a window or a bunch of windows in your home has two components. There's the material cost and the labor cost to install those windows.
Mm-hmm.
The labor cost is exactly the same, whether or not it is a standard window or a window which is more resistant to the damage from flying embers and debris. And what the code requires, if you're building a new building in a high fire hazard area, is dual glazed windows with at least one pane tempered. And that's the key, because you're in California, due to energy code requirements, you're going to have dual glazed windows anyway. Right. The only difference is whether or not one of those panes is tempered. And the difference in cost, it's less significant than you would think, but it makes a big difference because when there are flaming firebrands that are being blown against your home or something, the likelihood that window will fracture and the embers will land on your upholstered sofa or carpeting or something like that is greatly reduced.
Got it. So, Barbara, talk to me a little bit about Zone Zero. Since the fire in LA, I've heard that term several times. And candidly, before just maybe a year or two ago, I'd never heard that term. And so, what is Zone Zero, and are there other zones, and do they have numbers or letters? And what's so important about Zone Zero?
Well, Zone Zero is the most important. It was passed, legislation was passed in 2020 that they call it the non-combustible zone. So basically, years of research have concluded that the most likely reasons homes catch fire is due to combustible materials that are really close to the house, whether it's a wood pile or shrubs or a small tree or something like that. Those things are most likely to catch your house on fire. And so in California, it will be enforced as of January 2026. It will be enforced in areas that are currently designated at very high risk. And just to point out, if you look at fire risk maps, the ones that CAL FIRE produces every so often, the very high and the high risk has expanded and expanded and expanded, and people tell me all the time, I used to be in the moderate and now all of a sudden I'm in very high and my insurance is going to cancel me. So I feel like we need to be looking into the future and know that some of those places that are moderate or high now will be very high and require those things. And so I feel like requiring the non-combustible zone before it's mandated will really help the people in those homes, in new homes. I live in a 3-year-old house, and it came with wood chips that are snug right up against the structure. It came with beautiful little ornamental conifers right underneath my wood soffits in my zone 0. I took those out. My HOA didn't see me, but it's something that they're only requiring it in very high. Quite honestly, I disagree with, but that's what it is, and that's what it'll be as of 2026. There will be a 3-year grace period for existing homes to be able to conform to that. But I think potted plants, there are all kinds of little sort of exemptions, but even things like dumpsters might not be allowed. Potted plants, I think, will be allowed in that zone, but things that we recommend are, stone, concrete, sand, metal sculptures, metal benches, things like that. Anything that's non-combustible.
Mark, if I can add on, there was a whole lot of good information that Barbara shared there. And one of the things that she talked about was the effective date. And she indicated that early application of Zone 0 is a real smart thing to do. And of course, everybody can do that voluntarily right now. But even at a local level, the most recent community that I'm aware of is the city of Berkeley. They have gone ahead and they've adopted Zone 0 already. So if you're in a high fire hazard severity zone, that would apply. The second thing that I want to point out is I know that most of the audience enforces local rules and regulations. So you're very, very familiar with the concept of legal non-conforming status when something does not meet today's code, but it met the code that was in effect at the time it was built. That will not apply to Zone 0. And everybody needs to understand that, because Zone 0 is being promulgated through the Board of Forestry. It's not a building code or a fire code standard, which an individual would be able to say for their existing home, well, my home was built before Zone 0 was enforced, so it does not apply to me. It will apply to everybody, which is actually a good thing, because later on in the program, I think either Barbara or I will talk about the reason why it's so important for entire communities to protect themselves and not individual homes. But the concept of legal nonconformity won't apply to Zone 0.
So clearly that that's a change for some places, and the amount of change has to do with sort of the place where you are. But essentially, the basic concept here is that we're not allowing people to place kindling of all sorts, whether that's wood chips, flammable objects, plants, other things, in that first few feet. And is there a magic to the 5 feet? Is there a logic to that? In other words, do flammable objects further away from the building have less of an impact on catching that building on fire?
Yes, I mean, it's not to say that it's a magic number, but in Canada, it's a meter and a half, so it's definitely, we are doing the same thing, it has to do with radiant heat that could come off of anything burning that's close to the house. The radiant heat drops off, and Stuart knows the physics behind it. I haven't studied that part of it. I don't remember but it does drop off the farther away you go. It's just like a campfire.
Something squared, right?
Yeah, you know exactly what it is. Barbara mentioned the radiant heat. Radiant heat is one of the most significant sources of energy, which causes that initial ignition. But what ends up happening is a combination of the radiant heat that the side of a building or the eaves might be exposed to for a prolonged period of time. And then all of a sudden, direct flame impingement occurs, and it's already so hot, it just ignites. And so fences, wooden gates, that ornamental landscaping, these are all ladder fuels that when the embers are cast and they blow and they start that little fire, a little flame against the cold side of a house is not going to cause it to ignite. But the magic word that Barbara mentioned when she said radiant heat, imagine that the face of that building has been facing your neighbor's home that's been burning for the past 3 hours, it's already pretty hot. And when those ladder fuels, such as a wooden gate or something, catches on fire and the fire migrates to the point where you get flame impingement on the side of the house, your house is going to go.
Got it. So that explains why when I went out to sort of see a large working fire as a city manager, I noticed that one of the engines was actually dumping water on the adjacent building. It's like, oh, did they get confused to which one was on fire? It's like, nah, they didn't actually. So they were trying to keep that building cool so it wouldn't ignite. And so that's essentially that same logic that we're trying to do here is, again, give ourselves the best possible chance of not having a bunch of these things burning against the side of the building, something nearby burning, throwing off a lot of radiant heat, a place to catch a bunch of burning embers to collect them to sort of start a direct flame. All of those things contribute in their own little way to sort of making the building. Is there any way to predict in my house and anything to do about, you hear that embers blow and they collect in places around buildings. Do we know kind of where they're going to collect in buildings? Obviously, I don't want to have a large scale fire to test that, but is there any way that sort of things that we can observe now will tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. When you look in the corners of your home outside, anywhere that the leaves collect, anywhere that little pieces of dirt collect, anywhere your plant material or anything dry, that's what used to be living, any kind of plant material, wherever that collects, that's where your embers are going to collect.
Right. So local communities almost always have a wide variety of ordinances and rules. And in more than one case in my 30 years, some of our adopted rules, a state adopted rule, a federal adopted rule, a local adopted rule, conflicted with one another. So lots of places have requirements for plantings around buildings. Lots of places have requirements to preserve large vegetation. Trees are a great example where you have something that's several hundred years old, very large, might be very near a building, might overhang a building. Can you talk a little bit about how Zone 0 would impact that? In other words, is Zone 0 from the ground to the sky? Or is it literally 5 feet away from the building? And if the building's 1 story and this tree is very, very tall and is way more than 5 feet away from the building, but overhangs it 15 or 20 feet above it, does that have to be dealt with as well? Can you talk just a little bit about large vegetation in buildings?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a trade-off, right? Because those large trees also provide us with shade and potentially reduce energy use. But the way that they've written it is that and again, this is only in the very high fire zone that they're enforcing, or they will be enforcing it. If the bole of the tree is inside the 5-foot zone, and the tree is 10 feet higher than the house or than the roof, it can stay as long as the branches are 10 feet higher than the roof. If the branches are 10 feet low or not 10 feet higher, then they'll need to be trimmed or the tree will need to be taken out. If the tree branches are, right up against the house, because if you think about it, if it's a bole of a tree, the branches are very likely to either be touching the house, or overhanging over the roof. And those are the kinds of things we want to avoid. So
in many cases, it is about providing the space between the vegetation and the building envelope itself.
Yes.
To get there. And then the joy of this is, like all the rest of the regulations, is there trade-offs. This is sort of gosh, I love my roses right up against my house, but even though they're relatively small scale, the Zone 0 requirement would sort of say, no, right up against the house, you want to have stuff that's just not going to burn in any way, shape, or form.
Right. And you'll go to a greenhouse or whatever, and a lot of places will say, this plant is fire resistant. Any combustible material will burn given the right conditions.
So talk a little bit about, so you have a protected, that we've got a local ordinance, or even sometimes ordinances come from other place that is protecting vegetation, like a tree or an oak or something like that, and zone 0 requirements. So the zone 0 requirements, where they're adopted and in the zones that they're adopted, that's essentially a state law, and that would
Yes.
have precedence over those. So ultimately, the local jurisdiction is going to need to figure out a way to implement that one way or the other, to either acknowledge or to rectify or to add to those local ordinances to say, you have to protect this, but in cases where you've basically got a conflict with state law, you have to ultimately deal with that in, probably they'd say, the least abusive way you possibly can to the oak tree. That might be trimming, as you suggest, rather than removal. And of course, an enormous oak tree within 5 feet of your foundation is probably not too much fun either. So, all right, but that is going to be, for planners are going to be in the, at least nearby the middle of that sort of, because in certain communities, the love of trees is more profound than their love of residents. So not a trivial issue to work through.
Yeah, I mean, some of the things that we recommend in terms of vegetation is, rather than planting things right up, if you're moving things out beyond that 5 feet, then, try to still plant things in like little groups, little islands, so that you're not creating, space for continuous flame, which could still create a lot of radiant heat for your house. If you have your entire backyard is filled with vegetation and there are no breaks, right? That could still potentially be a lot of radiant heat for your house, even if it is beyond the 5 feet. So we're kind of thinking about, and this part's just a recommendation. You can still have vegetation in that 30-foot zone. Or in the next, I believe the next zone is the 5 to 30 foot, which in California, there's another zone beyond that, the 30 to 100 foot. And most people, I live on the Central Coast, most people here, unless you're on a ranch or out in the country, you don't have anything beyond 30 feet.
Right.
But yeah, you can have vegetation in that 5 to 30 foot zone. You just want to be safe about it, but they're not specifically regulating that. Those are all just recommendations at this point.
So talk a little bit about, there is some confusion around, in wildland areas, I've seen diagrams where Cal Fire wants you, if you're on your 100-acre property, wants you to sort of have no big trees, no big vegetation within X feet. It's way more than 5 feet. It's 30 feet or 100 feet in some cases. And so we're not talking about regulations prohibiting vegetation within 30 feet or within 100 feet. We're talking literally that prohibition is concentrating on that zone 0 at that 0 to 5. And then right now, is it recommendations in urban areas beyond the 5 feet? Or is that an absolute requirement for certain less flammable items in there, or lower density issues?
It's just a recommendation at this point for urban areas. There is that defensible space code for more rural areas that are in the very high zones, but it's still not completely, eliminating all vegetation. It's more about spacing and maintenance. I mean, if you have a huge eucalyptus that's 50 feet from your house, they might want you to get rid of that. But eucalyptus are special, and nobody's planting those right now anyway. Hopefully.
So Stuart, talk a little bit about, we've talked about some of these codes being applicable in very specific areas. In other words, high and very high wildfire, areas. Are the codes adopted by local government? Are some of these automatic? They're statewide instantly, and the local government can add on to that. Can you talk a little bit about the code adoption process and the local amendment process? Because I think for planners who've seen it at a distance, it seems more than a little confusing.
Sure. The way it works in California is that the California Building Standards Commission, or CBSC as we refer to it, adopts every 3 years Title 24 of the California Code of Regulations, and that's generally referred to as the Building Standards Code. That will automatically take effect throughout the state on a specific date. It's occurring again, and on January 1st of next year, a new code will take effect throughout the state. A jurisdiction has the ability to make local amendments, but those local amendments are not allowed to reduce the fire and structural safety of buildings. Local jurisdictions can only make them more protective if they can specify a specific local need based on a local geologic, topographic, or climatic condition, which makes that local amendment necessary. Now, I'm actually glad that you're asking this question, because it turns out that a lot of jurisdictions miss something, and it has to do with the fire hazard severity zones. The state of California publishes maps that are referred to as either the SRA or LRA maps. And if you are in an incorporated city, what you care about are the LRA maps, which are the local responsibility areas. And every area that is designated as a very high fire severity zone on the LRA maps are the areas where the ignition resistance standards of Chapter 7A or R337 will apply. In unincorporated county areas, which are regulated by the state, the LRA maps do not apply. The SRA maps apply, and those are state responsibility areas. And the reason that it's important to understand that is in non-incorporated areas of various counties, these ignition resistance standards apply in all of the elevated fire hazard severity zones. So whether it's moderate, high, or very high, it will apply. That's very different than in incorporated cities where it only applies to very high. The important thing that I need to point out is that, unfortunately, many jurisdictions in California think that as soon as the state publishes the maps, they are effective. That's not the case. Those are recommendations, and local jurisdictions are required to adopt their own fire hazard severity zones. And it's not hard to do by local ordinance. If they don't want to do any work, they can just adopt the state maps and they will get those maps. But there are some jurisdictions that believe errantly that once those maps are published, because their city is shown in an area that's shown as red or orange, they think that these are their zones. That's not the case. You actually have to pass an ordinance locally.
Got it. So let's talk just for a minute about that process. So let's say I work for a city and a portion of my city shows up in the red, right up against a set of wild vegetation of some sort there. But parts of the city are not in that very high. They're in a moderate area. Can the local jurisdiction, you touched on this, in other words, what would be the process for the local jurisdiction to say, gosh, I've got this checkerboard in my community, I'd rather just treat my entire community the same, rather than to say that this guy on Walnut Street has one set of regulations and on Oak Street right next door has a different set of regulations. If they sort of said, based on the fact that a noticeable portion of our community is required to do this, we want to do the whole community. Is that a process that local decision makers can work with their local staffs to ultimately develop the regulations to do that?
The answer is yes. There are actually a number of ways that it can be done. The easiest way that it can be done is, and I'll cite it right now, so anybody who wants to write it down can write it down. In our current version of Title 24, Chapter 7A, Section 701A.3.1, there is a sub-provision that a lot of people don't notice, but it's in here. It allows local jurisdictions to designate those areas that they feel are a wildland interface fire area. Okay, the state is not going to do that for you. They will identify very high and moderate fire severity zones, but they're not going to define for a local jurisdiction what that jurisdiction's wildland interface fire area is. And so I'm just going to read it. It's one sentence, but it's very, very empowering for a community if you're aware of this section, and it has been subject to close calls before. Section 701A.3.1 reads, new buildings for which an application for a building permit is submitted on or after July 1st, 2008, located in any fire hazard severity zone or wildland interface area shall comply with all sections of this chapter, including all of the following areas. And there's a list, and item 3 says land designated as wildland interface fire area by cities and other local agencies. And there are some cities in California that are aware of this, and they've taken steps to protect themselves, and they've designated their entire city as a wildland interface fire area. And once you do that, all of the standards that we've been talking about will apply to the construction of new homes.
And so let's talk for that for just a quick minute there, because now I think you made a super important distinction in that last sentence you said, which is, let's say that I'm doing a lot of new construction in my community, and I ultimately want all of that to sort of meet the highest standards here. But I am less politically motivated to make all of my existing homes, in the core of the city, meet these same standards. Does this have like the zone 0 did, where it applies to everybody instantly? Does this apply to existing buildings if I adopt these codes, or is this only the way most of the building code is? When I make a change to the building, I have to comply?
It only applies to new construction, unless the building was built after July 1st of 2008, because that building should have already been constructed to these standards. So any modifications would have to be consistent with those ignition resistance standards as well. So really, really old existing non-conforming buildings have never been subjected to these standards statewide for remodels, alterations, etc. There are some communities through the local adoption process that have modified their local code to make it applicable to existing construction. And their argument being that, due to local climatic conditions, dry, hot Santa Ana and Diablo winds and so forth, results in elevated fire risk. And therefore, if somebody is going to build an addition to a home, and that home has all sorts of non-conforming problems, including a roof that may not comply properly, that addition is still going to have to be built properly to today's standards, whether or not there is a retrofit trigger. And you guys are all planners, so you're all familiar with the 50% thresholds that some communities have and so forth. If you exceed a certain threshold, would you have to retrofit the rest of the building? Some communities have strategically identified certain features that would need to be upgraded, such as roofs, vents, and things like that.
And so on those items, that certainly does seem to make a lot of sense. Does that apply when somebody comes in to get a re-roof, that they basically have to meet new materials, or that they might have to do their roof vents at that same moment? Is that some of the things that are likely to happen as we sort of begin to adopt these new codes more universally?
Yes, and only because there's a special carve out in Chapter 7A that identifies two things that even if it's an existing building, if you are going to replace it, you have to replace it properly. And those are your roofing and your attic ventilation. So if you have a building which is non-conforming, you can't just remove the roof and put back what was there before, even if that would be allowed in non-fire hazard areas. If you are in a fire hazard area and you remove a non-conforming roof, you will have to put in a conforming roof because roofs are such a high-risk feature of a building. Likewise, if you change out the vents to your attic, you will have to put ember intrusion resistant vent screens in there.
Got it.
And this is, Stuart, this is also relevant in terms of post-fire recovery, you know, when communities are looking at rebuilding. I mean, for example, in Coffee Park, I believe it was always in the moderate zone, and maybe it's in the high zone now. I can't remember how that's changed, but all of those homes that were rebuilt at the old, with the old code. And
Yeah,
they were not required to be updated. But I feel like that might be something for communities, you know, that sort of needs to be shared, because I didn't know that communities could self-designate themselves as high severity. And in that recovery phase, I feel like that might be a really good thing to do.
Yeah, and you know, a lot of policy makers are on this video conference, and so this is something that you really, really need to hear. After a disaster, there are conflicting desires. One desire is to help ease the pain and expedite and simplify people's ability to rebuild and get back into their homes and in their communities. And a term that just is appalling to me has been thrown around in recent fires, and it's like for like reconstruction. And I've also heard that in some instances, there is a desire to go like for like and even allow people to rebuild with some modest increases in size or height. Now, it's a balancing act, because on the one hand, there really is benefit to helping people get back into their homes and their communities. But as Barbara just said, Coffee Park is actually an example of a situation where an entire community burned down and it was built back exactly the way that it was before. And whether or not the policymakers find it appropriate to impose new standards, which will cost more money in some instances, to people who have already suffered a devastating loss, who may not even have proper insurance to cover reconstruction, I'm not in a place to judge or evaluate that. But it is something that communities need to think about, because if there is a fire once, you know, it's not like lightning where you say lightning will never strike here again. If the conditions existed which supported a fire once, the likelihood is you're probably going to get another fire sometime in the future. And so at what point and at what level do you impose increased standards to reduce the likelihood of those initial ignitions? It's a balancing act.
It is. And just on the vegetation management side of things, when you're looking at ecosystems like, you know, chaparral, whether it's, you know, Southern California chaparral or Central Coast chaparral, there are certain ecosystems that grow back so fast. And so the ability to reburn can happen within a few years. So like you said, it doesn't mean it's not going to burn again. There are some ecosystems that will take longer to grow enough vegetation. Chaparral is definitely not one of those ecosystems.
Well, you guys join the chorus of voices that we've heard over the weeks that we've been doing this, that says one of the very best indicators of an area that will have a large scale burn is it's had it before. And so as we facilitate rebuilding, we do need to do it with our eyes open, knowing that it is very likely that an area will burn again, or that the conditions that led to the burn will exist again. Now, if we build back a very different community that is hardened very differently, the vegetation exists very differently, the interface between the wildland and the urban area exists very differently, perhaps the outcome changes. Maybe we don't lose 1,000 or 10,000 homes, but there's still going to be that ignition. There's still going to be that risk coming right up and into our communities there. Got a question from the audience that said they were aware of certain foothill communities that had brick buildings that had fire shutters for windows. First of all, is that a thing? And second of all, is it an effective strategy in areas where there might be an interface?
Okay, so let me comment on this. This is actually something that has been an idea, and it's been implemented by many, many people for years. And can it be effective? Of course. One of the construction strategies in Chapter 7A deals directly with windows. As I mentioned, they are required to be dual glazed with at least one tempered pane. And the idea is that when you get wind-driven firebrands just blowing and banging against your windows, it doesn't fracture and you don't get those embers landing on your upholstered sofa, carpeting, and so forth. Whether or not it's a piece of tempered glass, or if you have enough notice, put up some sort of a shutter, it can do the same thing. In fact, I know a person that for very, very low cost, it was a heck of a lot cheaper than replacing all the windows, had some discreetly placed hooks placed above every single window. And he has a plywood cover that covers those windows, that if he has advance notice, because there's a fire coming and he knows that pretty soon there's going to be either voluntary or mandatory evacuation, one of the things that he does is he goes to his garage and they're all labeled, and in 20 minutes he can put a cover over every window. And I got to tell you, you can have a flaming branch from a tree come down and smack the window, and if there's a sheet of plywood over it, it's just going to bounce off. And so the fire shutters, if the person that posted that question observed an ignition resistant building, whether it's brick or some other type of non-combustible material with some sort of protective shutter, it can be very effective.
All right, other questions that came in, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit. Do you have an idea, Stuart or Barbara, on roughly doing things like moving from a like for like to a properly hardened building? So that means that the windows would meet the standards, the siding would meet the standards, the roof would meet the standards, the vents would meet the standards. Do you have a sense of, is that 1% of construction costs, 5% of construction costs, 10% of construction costs, 50%? It's more expensive, but dramatically so, or incrementally so, or is this one of those answers where it depends?
It really does depend on what type of features they want to put there.
Yeah.
But for the vast majority of the envelope of a building, let's take the highest risk, roof. In all likelihood, all roofing is going to be pretty close to compliant these days. There are some profiles of roofing tile which are not completely sealed. They don't lay flat against each other and embers can get in. But for the most part, fiberglass shingle, asphalt shingle that are all Class A, they all meet the code. As I mentioned before, due to energy, you're going to have dual glazed windows anyway. And to rebuild a home, the labor cost is already factored in. To pay a little bit extra to get one pane tempered, I would consider that to be just an incremental cost on that aspect of materials. Some of the other things, the vent material for your attics or your underfloor crawl space, while there are some very, very fancy proprietary ember intrusion resistant vent devices, you can also use a very, very tight 1/16 to 1/8 inch max galvanized metal mesh screen, which will do the job. Reducing that opening all the way down to 1/8, whereas most existing homes have 1/4-inch mesh. That's a big difference, and it will prevent intrusion of a lot of embers. But I would say, while I don't have a number, maybe Barbara does, I would say that to get the big ticket items, which are really going to dramatically increase the likelihood of survival, is probably nominal.
Got it. And then the last piece here I want to touch on is, especially if we develop the zone 0 space properly on the day the building is built, and we've got a nice clear 5 feet with very few little ornamental things, maybe some potted plants here and there and some other things. Has anyone developed an effective system so that the homeowner doesn't stack a wood pile there, or do something that is, operational, or I happen to live in the space, that sort of undoes all of the good work? Is that simply an ongoing community outreach and communication, or have you actually seen places that sort of deal with that from a regulatory standpoint?
It is sort of an ongoing outreach and education piece. However, I think once they get to the enforcement of those things, it could end up being, neighbors policing neighbors. It could end up being sort of that peer pressure community piece of it that ends up, reducing those factors.
One of the comments was, the lesson of Coffee Park is that in any neighborhoods vulnerable to wind-driven wildfire, the entire city should have been a high-risk area there. We've got just a couple minutes left, and I wanted to give both of you the chance to sort of leave our folks with either emphasis of something we've already said, that if they take away one thing, please take this away, or that maybe we didn't trip over it in enough emphasis to sort of wrap up here. We have tried to cover an incredibly broad topic in a very short period of time. So I would caution everybody here to use some of the resources that were put into the chat, to look at California APA for some of our document library. There's way more there. But Barbara, I'm going to start with you and give you a couple of minutes, and then Stuart, if you could wrap us up.
Yeah, I'd like to see, working with, in terms of the pre-planning, certainly getting ahead of that zone 0 requirement and doing it in places even where it's not required, because it doesn't cost much. And whether the landowner ends up choosing to put something in, the homeowner chooses to put something in, if they end up having to, go with zone 0 and they end up enforcing that, they'll have to take it out anyway. But at least if you give them a clean slate to start with, and we can educate our communities that why it looks the way it does, I think entire neighborhoods can end up being more fire resilient. And like the one person said, it can happen anywhere. It absolutely can. The other piece is looking at building structure and roof structure that can potentially reduce ember catching, like the catchment for embers. And I am not that person, but just there are people who can design around that, designing roofs that are less complicated so that if stuff collects on the roof, it's not collecting all right next to, a piece of siding that sticks out on a dormer or something like that. Any vegetation will burn. That's another one, obviously. Don't plant really big things right next to the house. And then the other piece is just thinking about some of the open spaces, surrounding neighborhoods. Maybe thinking about that from the perspective of future wildfire reduction. And maybe we could potentially design things that would be easy, where it would be easy to implement regular prescribed burning around neighborhoods, because that really could help protect a neighborhood. If you don't have things burning right outside the neighborhood, yes, embers can still be cast a long ways, but they'll be fewer and farther between. So
thank you, Barbara. Stuart, any final thoughts here?
Yeah, two things. I mentioned one of them before, and both Barbara and I have danced around the second one. The first one, I have to stress that the way we need to look at our communities and how we regulate them is assume that the fire department will not come to put out the fire. like I said, we have fires throughout this country every single day. And when there's a singular fire because somebody left something simmering on the stove overnight and the cat jumped up on the counter and knocked over the paper towels, fire departments are really, really good at putting out a singular fire. It's when they are so overwhelmed because they're trying to prevent the wildland fire from eating up entire communities, you just have to assume that they're not going to show up and save my home, because that comes down to the second idea. As planners, I think everybody needs to focus on the issue of community risk versus individual risk. Looking at homes one at a time to harden a home one at a time or reduce the risk of one home, that would not have saved anybody in the Eaton fire or the Palisades fire. Because once it gets to urban conflagration, the real issue is if the fire department isn't going to show up and the home next door is going to be burning for the next 5-6 hours, if you only have 5-foot setbacks, that's a whopping 10 feet between your buildings. Radiant heat is a huge contributor to structural ignition, and the heat dissipates as a function of the square of distance. And so if you were to increase that distance, if you were to double that distance, so instead of having 10 feet between homes, 5 plus 5, you had 20 feet, you would reduce the heat exposure just from the radiant heat by 4 times, just by doubling it. And so the idea of reducing community risk versus individual structural risk is the real way to save communities.
Well, and that's where we will leave it. And planners are used to looking at things at a community-wide level, and especially both as we are rebuilding and building new, taking that next step forward, because we can now see what's coming. It's already applied some places. We know that it's coming. It's way easier if we do it from the ground up as we start. And so from that perspective, I want to thank Barbara and Stuart. Thank you guys. This has been great. I want to let everybody know that we will have future webinars. We've got one coming up on mental health. We're going to finalize the dates here in the next couple of weeks and get that back out. So take a look at the APA website for the dates on that. And with that, we'll wrap up today. So thank you guys. Appreciate everybody being part of it.
Thanks.